We are recording now.
Okay,
Anytime.
cool. Um, hi everyone. My name's Amira. I use they them pronouns. I work at First People's Multicultural Trans and Queer Support Services, and I'm the Trans and Queer Initiatives Coordinator there, which is to say I just do a lot of like LGBTQ stuff on campus. And other things about me. I'm a first generation college graduate in my family. I'm an immigrant, and so I moved from Manila, Philippines to Vegas first, and then kind of made my way up to Olympia, Washington over the years that I've lived here. I'm Ilocano and I'm Bicolano. My dad's Ilocano and my mom's Bicolano. So uh, yeah, but I grew up with a very intensely Tagalog uh, childhood, like in terms of like culturally, I identify most as like Tagalog. Um, and Other things about me, I'm queer, I identify as non binary, and I also, in terms of like cultural identity, have definitely been over like the last 2 years, um, being identified more as bakla too, which is the like Tagalog term for I guess like what would be equivalent, or I don't know, language is kind of messy, but the closest I can think of it in terms of like English word is like two spirit. But I don't want to identify as two spirit just because I feel like culturally for me that's not a term that I feel really comfortable with identifying with. But yeah, that's just a little bit about me. I didn't really like prepare a PowerPoint, but I just think because of the size of our group, I wanted to create more intimacy and just like openness about if we just like opening up a conversation. I'm happy to share like my story and like how I came out and stuff like that. And so if that's okay, then I will do that instead.
All right, awesome. Sounds good to me. I just have a quick question,
Sure.
and to give you a little bit of context. So, Hannah came the other night and talked
Hmm.
about implicit bias.
Hmm.
The next day, just by coincidence, the lecture that we had in class was about binary language, and we were
Hmm.
mostly focusing on the terms good and bad, but we were
Hmm.
showing how a lot of different binaries kind of become subject to that good and bad.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of questions about what binaries even are during that
Mhm.
lecture. And so maybe you can explain what non-binary would actually be.
For sure. Yeah. So I actually didn't um, identify as non-binary for a really long time. But I think over the years, like when people I've come to learn that the term non-binary means like somebody who is more fluid in their gender identity. So like gender identity meaning like what you like believe your gender to be. Um, and so what you feel inside your gender to be. Um, and I didn't really feel like I was just one, or I didn't identify with just one gender, but like I felt like, it's pretty fluid and I identified with lots of different things in terms of like feminine or like masculine identities. And so um, that's how I ended up like identifying as non-binary. Um, but just like I think in terms of like binaries as it like relates to gender, so typically like people think of like gender as like you're like a man or a woman, right? And I would say that like thinking of only those two binary identities is very much like Western, like very like Eurocentric idea of genders. Like a lot of indigenous peoples um, have, have more than two genders, and I think that uh, like the history of colonization has sort of like erased a lot of like what those previous cultures are. Certainly, like in my culture, I'm Filipino. Um, that's definitely something that um, isn't very well known and isn't talked about. Similarly to like indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, here in our like area, like the Bakla were also kind of like they were really important people to in our tribes in terms of they were shamans, they were people who were sort of like in betweens, very much like two people. They kept a lot of cultural traditions alive, even through colonization and intense erasure from colonizers. And so a lot of the things that I know of, like Bakla folks, like Babaylan, like um, cultural practices in the Philippines were preserved because like because they sort of just like kept practicing it in secret, you know. Um, and so I think that that's something that's sort of like a thread that's common amongst like a lot of Two-Spirit folks on Turtle Island, where cultural practices are sometimes preserved through Two-Spirit folks.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I think I went like off on a tangent. It's like 5 o'clock, so I'm like, oh.
Well, it's actually really important. What we're doing for the class, the bridge class, is we're reading The Conquest of New Spain, which
Okay.
actually is extremely binary in terms of what's good, what's bad. It's very
Yeah.
Eurocentric,
Mhm.
and women are actually used as they're used as money basically to
Mhm.
purchase things, and
Mhm.
they're actually the Indians are, and that's how they're referred to in the book, and
Mhm.
they're really harshly
Mhm.
ridiculed by the Inquisition for any
Mhm.
sort of practices that are not in
Mhm.
line with the Christian idea of a man and a woman
Mhm.
being together. And so they
Mhm.
were punished for that quite a bit. And I think that a lot of
Mhm.
that conversation about how there are different identities with different
Mhm.
indigenous groups is really helpful for
Mhm.
thinking about the Spanish coming into America and
Mhm.
then suddenly seeing the
Mhm.
Mexicans and being appalled by that.
Mhm.
So that's helpful for the context.
Oh yeah, for sure. I guess like I want to add to that too. Like, you know, something similar happened to the Philippines because the Philippines was colonized by Spain for like 333 years. And like I think that some of the things that like colonizers, like Spanish colonizers, did to like Bakla folks, because most of them, though not all, most of them were um, through like colonizers' eyes, like men who were dressing up as women, and so uh, you know, so I think too, like there was like a lot of erasure of what like cultural knowledge and importance like Bakla men, like Bakla folks had in uh, like pre-colonial, like Philippines pre-contact history. So, and I just, yeah, so I imagine there was a lot of parallels in Mexico too.
Definitely.
Yeah. Cool. So, I mean, I guess I can share a little bit about like my personal story of just I think like in terms of like media representation and how that relates to like coming out. And so I've always like known and felt really different, you know, for a really long time, even when I was younger. My mom would lovingly tell me uh, that you're always so eccentric. And that was her way of, I think, like in terms of language, like that was her way of saying, like, oh, I always knew you were gay. Uh, which is really sweet. I think that there is like a misconception, and sometimes like the media like portrays like families of color as like people who just like reject like their children, especially if they're queer. I know that like the Philippines is like heavily Catholic. It's one of like the I would say most Catholic like country in like the continent of Asia. Maybe I could be wrong, but 300 plus years of Spanish colonization is uh pretty deep. And so I think like because there's like such like heavy Catholic like culture in the Philippines, that it was really difficult for me to even think, or like I didn't have words to be like I am gay like when I was 5 years old. There was nothing like that. I didn't know of like any other like book club folks in my life. And so I think like moving to the US, um, I also like really didn't see a whole lot of like representation of like LGBTQ folks. And when I did, um, like the media representations where like somebody came out and then like they got kicked out, or they like died or something, or like whatever, like something bad happened to them. um and so even I would say up until high school, like my senior year, I wasn't really sure like what to describe myself as. At first I had identified as bisexual, and that was kind of I think that was like my junior or senior year of high school, and folks were definitely like I would say that some of the friends I had who were girls were like, oh no, now she's gonna try to make out with me or something. But I was like, I'm really not interested in you just because I identify as bisexual. Um, so, um, but still, I think like it wasn't until college that I really ended up like learning more about myself, and having sort of like the words to say like I'm queer, identify as queer, non-binary, and part of it was because I just like had access to more people, and like education I think was like a really big part of it. Just like having language to describe myself, um, and also like other people who um, like had like positive thoughts about like LGBTQ identities was like super helpful in terms of like coming out. So I guess like I didn't necessarily like come out to my like family in high school. So it was pretty gradual in college, and so it wasn't like like in the movies where somebody's like, I came, mom, dad, I'm gay. It wasn't like that at all. So it's very gradual, um and I think that like everybody has a different story of coming out, and it's not going to look like mine. Um, and so like things that you see in the movies about like young queer people, young gay people, LGBTQ people, like that's their story, and like everyone's is gonna look really different. Um, but I guess like the most important thing is like coming out to yourself. um is the most important thing, is just like really accepting and loving yourself, which also I don't see on TV. But I do think that like places like Instagram and Twitter have been pretty helpful. Yeah, TikTok is pretty queer too. um, so I think that younger folks now have a lot easier time to like learn about like see like more positive like LGBTQ like representations. Slowly but surely, I think it's getting there.
And actually, that we got a question yesterday during our workshop or our lecture on binaries, and
Mm-hmm.
being that we were talking about binary language, not necessarily about binary identities. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
really have an answer. I just had a guess. And
Yeah.
so, one of the binaries that we were discussing was a binary that people are either gay or straight, which we do tend to
Mm-hmm.
hear. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, we're talking about all these different binaries with the association of good and
Mm-hmm.
bad and what that
Mm-hmm.
means. And the question that we received yesterday was, at what point did the word gay, which actually means happy and like jovial and like things that are supposed to be associated with positivity, at what point did that word come to like be so you'll hear like in communities, especially out in Shelton, people will say that they don't like something, something's bad, something's stupid, and they'll use the word gay for it. So at what point in our history did that happen? If you know.
I have no idea, but I know that like the I seriously don't know. I couldn't even like make a guess about gay when gay turned to gay. um but I do know that the word queer is similar, and that like queer was a term used as like a derogatory term, so like um that people would use like back in the day. I don't know how long back in the day was, but um I think like around like the 90s, like the term queer started to be reclaimed by like LGBTQ folks, mostly like in college, in like academia. People started to identify as queer in the 90s. And I know that that's definitely still like there's still a generational divide amongst like folks like older like LGBT folks don't sound older LGBT folks don't like the word queer at all, and like don't identify with it. It like just like creates a lot of like, because it's a word that has been used against them in the past, to hurt them, and so um, the word queer has been like on like that good bad spectrum, um, too, in the past. It's definitely more accepted now, but there's definitely still some like older like LGBT elders that are like, no, 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 no. Why are you using that word? Don't speak that word in my presence. Yeah.
Thank you. That's
Yeah.
helpful for me.
Very well.
Uh-huh.
I'm just curious to know if we could ask the new person that just joined us for his, her, or their identification. Like, I don't know who iPhone is.
Yeah, I was actually just about to ask, iPhone, can you let us know who you are so that we can take attendance? iPhone, who are you?
Hello.
There we go. Hi, who do
Can you
we
hear
have?
me? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, is this Felipe? Okay, so I'll put you in the attendance. Sorry about that. We just want to make sure who we have here so that we know that we don't have any Zoom bombers, okay?
Oh, okay.
All right, thanks. You can go ahead and mute yourself and I'll mark you as here, okay?
Okay.
Thanks. All right, carry on, Amira. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. It's okay. Yeah, I guess I'm curious if folks like, have any questions about anything. Like, I was just like, well, it's gonna be pretty intimate. So if you're like, I've wanted to ask this question, but I thought like it would be really offensive or whatever, like, I am also here as a queer to answer your questions.
And if you want to keep your questions, maybe you don't want to ask it in front of other people. I made Amira co-host, and what you can do
cool.
is type in, I believe you can do this. I'm host, so I have everybody show up, but you should be able to type in questions in the chat, and then Amira can answer them without revealing who asked the questions too. So that's another way that you can practice that.
For sure. Cool.
Maybe a good question would be that I have is, can you explain some of these terms that maybe come up in college that we don't really hear at high school? So like cisgender is something that I hear
Mhm,
at the college level that I haven't heard at high school.
mhm.
And those different identities, and then maybe the
For sure.
importance of pronouns and stuff too. Um,
Yeah, yeah. So y'all might have noticed, like in the beginning of the Zoom call, I introduced myself using they them pronouns. And what I will say first about like pronouns is that um not everybody identifies with he as their pronouns or her as their pronouns, and so they them typically like non-binary folks use them, or like folks who are identifying as genderqueer or gender fluid. And I would say that the reason you why a lot of folks like in college like introduce themselves, like if they're like staff or like a professor or like a teacher or something, is to indicate like I know about pronouns. I know that there are like trans folks and non-binary folks and genderqueer folks in my class, and so like it's sort of like a practice to say like here are my pronouns. I want to integrate myself as like a safe person. Um, and yeah, I also think that um, like uh, people will share their pronouns and use the pronouns that they're given, because it's not really like you can't like base somebody else's gender based on like their appearance. And so like unless you asked me like what my pronouns were, and what pronouns I use, like you may not even know like what pronouns I want to use, like based on what I look like. And so I think like I definitely encourage everyone to like think about that. Like I'm not saying like go up to everybody and be like, "What's your pronouns?" Or like go up to somebody who like looks like they might be trans and ask them for their pronouns, and only that person. Um, but I think just like as a practice to think about pronouns and how that can be really useful, especially for like trans folks, to like know like what pronouns that they're wanting to use. In terms of like vocabulary words, I would say that like words like genderqueer and gender fluid are really similar to non-binary, in a sense like where folks who identify as like gender fluid, so I would like say like fluid is sort of like the key term. So folks who are gender fluid can um, like feel like one day they might be more feminine, or the next day like more masculine, or some days they're both, but that their like gender identity is like fluid, so it's not like one gender. um, it's not just like one gender at any given moment. I would say really similar for genderqueer, where again, like it's not necessarily just one gender, but um, that like you're also like queering your gender, or you're not normalizing gender. Um, other terms that, other terms that um, you want me to like talk about, or
So, have you guys heard of any other terms that were maybe confusing when you heard them? Maybe you want to know what they mean. It's okay to be ignorant of some of these terms because we were raised all in the same society for the most part if we were spending the most part of our lives in this country. And so some of these things might be unfamiliar to us. We may have heard about them maybe through pop culture. But clarifying that now can be really helpful, so that we can make sure that we're behaving respectfully and responsibly when we're off in college. But also, Sebastian, you've been at Evergreen for a few years now. Are there any terms that have been confusing, or maybe when you were first in college were confusing to you?
Yeah, I encounter as I mean, as an immigrant, I encountered the idea of using this he, she, or they, them super confused. I mean, it was very confusing, the fact that as a English language learners, we can't jump. It's very hard to jump from Spanish translation and jump to the English version to call somebody that identify as a they, them. Something like they are thinking that is good, when in our head we know that it's either he or she. Like, that's our brain, how structures language works. Like you mentioned it before, it's just really tricky, because it literally tricky every single time that we want to produce a sentence, we are going to use either he, she, or it.
Yeah.
And then we kind of then get it, like, oh wait, she said or they said that it will be identifying us or this or that. And then that will, that will create this controversy, because we eventually, like Spanish speakers or French speakers, I know for sure that they will have a very hard time. And at the beginning then later on the road I get used to, but then I was the beginning it was hard, at times where I was just so confused, like, do they really understand that it isn't really that easy to jump to the language side? Like Riva said, we all were raised, and we all had this chip in our mindset that we came with it, and I don't know, but it's very hard now to start flipping those things out. But yeah, other than that, I think that is, I don't know, like, as a like you said, as an English language learner, it's not a big deal. We all learn a language. It's not like we're not gonna now, like, we're gonna freak out because we're just gonna add one or two pronouns extra to the ones that we. But yeah, I was just gonna share that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I like your perspective that you're like, well, it was difficult, but it was just like one or two pronouns. Well, it's okay. Yeah, I would say too, like, I have, like, my partner is Salvi and Cuban, and also Spanish is their first language, and they've been, for example, like for words that are gendered, so like for example like hija, like using x at the end, so like instead of hija, like changing it to like ihex, has been, some I've seen that as a practice for a lot of like Spanish speakers, and so I'm waiting for Tagalog speakers to also figure it out. But yeah, language is really interesting in that way. It's really dynamic.
Awesome. Thank you. Mundo and Lily, have you heard of any terms that were maybe confusing to you? Especially since you guys being from Shelton, you may not hear these terms quite as often, but it's definitely still relevant in Shelton. And so I don't know to what degree you guys are familiar with like the terminology around LGBTQ identities and stuff. And so do you have any questions about that? No questions? All right. So yeah, this is something that it takes a lot of us, because we're raised in this society. It takes a lot of us some time to adapt to. And I think, like Sebastian pointed out, like the different languages that we're using can actually impact how we're able to adapt to that. And we have to be a little bit flexible with it. And so, yeah, it's definitely a learning experience, learning how to be respectful to all different people and all different cultures, because of that implicit bias that Hannah was talking about the other night. We don't really understand what values we're walking around with and stuff like that. So I think one thing that might be helpful for these future Evergreen students to know is, what do you do if you make a mistake and you offend somebody?
Okay. Yeah. I see that often happening, like when somebody like forgets somebody's pronoun, or maybe like a trans person changes their name from like, something more like feminine, from like a masculine to like a feminine name, or vice versa. And so some things that I have done in the past, when like they pronouns were really new to me, I also like forgot sometimes like people's pronouns were they, and I would base like people's pronouns based on like what I perceived them, like what I thought their pronouns were, and when I would get corrected about it, I just say, I'm sorry, I'll do better next time. So it's very like matter of fact, like you don't really have to like make a big deal out of it. But you do have to mean it when you make a mistake and you say, I'm sorry, I'm gonna do better. Is to make sure that you don't do that mistake again. Some of the things I did in the when I started college, and found out about they pronouns was I would just say their name instead of using any pronoun at all, which was really helpful. Sometimes it felt really repetitive to be like, Amira's backpack is over there, and Amira's gonna be right back, and Amira just went to the bathroom, but Amira said that don't move Amira's backpack. So that sounds really repetitive, but I 100% knew that I wasn't misgendering or like using the wrong pronouns for somebody. And so those were some of the things I did in the very beginning to sort of like keep myself from like saying the wrong pronouns. And eventually I was like, well, I either like learn to remember somebody's pronouns, or I can keep saying their name over and over again, but either way, like it's gonna be like effective. So but I would say like if somebody tells you that you said something that was offensive, I do think like apologizing, just saying I'm sorry. um Sometimes it's useful to like ask what was offensive, you know, like especially if you're like you really don't know, so just like asking like, I'm really sorry, can I ask what was offensive about what I said, and then when they say it, to like thank them, just say thank you for taking the time to tell me what was hurtful and offensive to you, and I'll do better next time. So I would say that like works not just for like about like LGBTQ stuff, but like a lot of things. Like it's just like a good life skill to have.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I have people all the time thinking I'm Italian. I wish they would apologize when they realize they really that doesn't happen for that. And there's nothing wrong with Italians, but I'm definitely Mexican and I'm proud of that. So.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I encountered, not actually as a student, but a little bit more when I started working with the Upward Bound program and with some of my colleagues,
Mhm.
is that some people think that trans and gay are the same thing. So I'm hoping maybe you can touch on that a little bit. And then another thing that people also make assumptions about is they assume that cross-dressers or people who like to go and do drag are transgender. And so if you can maybe complicate that idea as well, that might be helpful for when Lily and Raimundo go off to college.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, so I would say that trans people, so like when we're talking about like I would say that like your gender identity and your sexual orientation. So like gender identity, whether you identify as cisgender, like as a cisgender man, or a cisgender woman, meaning like you identify with the sex that you were born with, um, versus like someone who's like transgender, like so that's gender identity. So like sexual orientation is like lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual. Um, they are two separate things. Like I would say, like socks, but two different patterns of socks. And I would say that just because you're transgender doesn't mean that you're also gay. So like a transgender person may be attracted to the same, a transgender person could identify as gay, but not every transgender person is gay. Does that make sense? Cool. And then and I would say the same thing about like gay folks, is that like some gay folks can be very feminine in their presentation, but may not necessarily identify as transgender. And for like folks who do drag, so like I would say like drag is a performance, like like you go on stage and you perform an act, but specifically like for drag, it's like you are performing gender. So it doesn't have to be like a drag queen. You could be a drag king. You could be also a androgynous drag person. I've seen sort of like drag performers with like beards that are like super like done up. There's like glitter and rhinestone. So like so drag isn't just reserved for drag queens. It goes beyond that. There's definitely folks who are playing more masculinity, or sometimes both, or neither one at all. I don't know, some people have done drag and they're like, I am a celestial being. So people have done that as like a drag performance. And so there are trans folks who do drag. Some transgender people do learn about their gender identity through the exploration of gender and like performing gender on stage, expressing like gender on stage. Some folks like realize, oh, I'm trans too. Some folks are the other way around, where they are trans and the only safe place that they can explore their trans identity is through the stage in a drag performance. So I think like there's lots of different sort of like types of people that do drag. Straight people also do drag. Cisgender people also perform, become drag performers sometimes. But yeah, I would say that drag is not like only for like a specific kind of person. So anybody can do drag, and go on stage and perform like gender. I would say too that the term like cross-dressing is some drag performers use that term. Some folks don't. Sometimes the term cross-dresser is used as like an offensive word towards a trans person, particularly if they don't believe the trans person like is actually a trans person. And so drag cross-dresser could be used as a pretty like derogatory or like offensive term to a trans person, but there are some trans folks who use that term. So yeah, I don't know, it gets, I guess that complicates things. And some drag performers call themselves cross-dressers, but it's not like typically like a word that you would use to describe somebody else if you are not that person. So
thank you, that's helpful. I have a couple of other questions that I think might be helpful for Amira to address while we're together, but I want to check and see if you guys have questions too, because ultimately this is something that's going to be, I don't know if it's necessarily new for you, but definitely engaging with these types of conversations in a school environment. They're going to come up. These conversations happen at Evergreen a lot, and it's not just at Evergreen. It happens at SPSCC, it happens at Wazoo, at UW. And so we want to make sure that you guys feel comfortable entering those spaces and having those conversations, or if you are uncomfortable, that you can handle that situation respectfully and responsibly. And so we want to make sure that you can get some of those maybe more confusing things clarified now so that you feel more comfortable advocating and becoming an ally. So do you guys have any questions before I go on with some of the questions that I have? No? Still learning? Oh, go ahead.
Just gonna say something quickly. That also applies, or the idea to be open to these like changes that you guys are gonna encounter at college, at least, also applies for names. So I worked for the 2 years that I was at Evergreen. I worked for this program that I work as a Spanish tutor. So I work within, the Waterford community of Evergreen. And one thing that I encountered was kind of funny at the beginning. It was hard and funny at the same time. It was that I had students that will come to the classroom. Since the classroom had like 50 people, they will come to the classroom, and one day they will be identifying as identifying. No, I mean, they will name themselves as jellyfish or blue butterfly or like anything like that, like and it's super like however they want to feel it. Like if they want to feel today like they feel like a butterfly, then they will call me butterfly. I'm today a butterfly. And it was interesting because it was definitely like you said, a new whole idea of yes, I'm learning language, yet it's developing, it's continuing, increasing other levels of mindset that I have to be able to organize and respect and cooperate. So that applies for names. I'm just gonna say that. So I have my list. This quick story I want to share is that I have my list, 50 people, but then at the end of the quarter I have like 75 people, and then it was because 2 people were identifying every single day like with a different name. So that tripped me because every single time that I called for butterfly, it wasn't butterfly anymore. It was something else, and then just yeah.
That's awesome. I'm so glad that you just rolled with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you guys have any comments about that or any questions?
I was totally spacing out the like half of that. So can you repeat like the second half of that?
So Sebastian, do you want to repeat a little bit about what you shared, or?
Yeah. Is that to me, Lily, or to Amira? Okay, to me. Okay, fine. Yeah. So again, just to be like also aware of names. Like for example, you Lily can, if you feel today that you wanna be called Lily, then it's fine. But then tomorrow, if you don't wanna be called Lily by, by X or Y circumstances, you can also use, princess, or I don't know. I'm just thinking words in my head. You can be called anywhere, anything that you want to be called. And people are very open minded to that. I encounter people that were like, no, call me Star or Blue Star today. I was like, okay, hi Blue Star. But there's not like I didn't do it with the intention of, yeah, whatever, I call you whatever the crap you want to call yourself. No, I did it like actually like I enjoy. If you feel like today like you are that you are mentioning me to be called, I will more than pleased to call you that way. Because also they were having a hard time calling my some people call me Sebastian or whatever, but I respect it. Like I don't like I'm not gonna get a stress if they can't pronounce it or if they can't spell it. So otherwise, they will be create this confrontation. But the idea is always be open mind to that and respect if somebody else is feeling different. Be a good Samaritan and be a good friend. Is that clear now, Lily? Okay.
Thank you, Sebastian. That's helpful. So do you guys have any other questions before I go into I have about 3 questions. No, okay, cool. So I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget them. So maybe I'll just read them all 3 at once, Amira, and you can pick which ones you want to answer in what order. So the first question is, where can students go to ask questions or to explore their identity or explore the spectrum and learn a little bit more about that within Evergreen, and then, you know, further out in the community if they wanted to explore it out in the community or support the community in that way? How can students at Evergreen become allies and support other students on the LGBTQ spectrum, even if they don't identify that way themselves? And what does your office do to support people specifically?
Okay. I wrote them down because I was like, I don't know if I can keep 3 questions in my head.
Yeah, I had to write them down too.
Cool. So in terms of where to go to, like if you were in a college setting and you're like, I'm really curious about like my identity, I think like going to an LGBTQ student resource center is like gonna be one of your first stops. So at Evergreen, that's First People's Multicultural Trans and Queer Support Services. That's our student resource center. It's a multicultural resource center. It also happens to provide LGBTQ student support services as well. But I would say that your first stop would be to go to any student resource center, even if it's not an LGBTQ resource center, because they would know where to direct you. But if there is an LGBTQ resource center on campus that you're at, they are places where anyone can go to. You don't have to identify as LGBTQ to be there. You can be an ally and just hang out there. Some things that I encourage folks to do, especially if they're just like, I just want to be really useful, I want to be an ally, is find out if there are any volunteer opportunities, whether that's like in a campus setting or in the community. So LGBTQ resource centers in the community are also places that you could go to. And typically for those ones, you do have to identify as queer, especially if it's like a queer youth resource center, partly because they exist because they're sort of like a safe space for queer and trans youth to be able to safely explore. And so it's more designed for LGBTQ youth versus allies, but you can still volunteer with them. Lots of different places are happy to have volunteers, whether that's to like help them with like a fundraiser or whatever it is that their space might need. I found that, I think for me, when I was a college student, that was like one of the easier ways to learn for me, was to volunteer, because typically when you do volunteer work, they will also like do volunteer training, and you actually learn quite a lot when people do volunteer trainings. So like, for example, like what not to say, what you can say. And also I think that doing volunteer work helps people who help like LGBTQ folks, that frees up time for them to do more things. And so you're not only learning more for yourself, but you're also supporting like the people who are supporting like LGBTQ communities. So it's sort of like a win-win situation. If you were wanting to be a good ally definitely volunteer work is a really, really good place to do that. I would say too, like, to support LGBTQ folks. Other things that you can do to be a good ally is just like reading stuff on your own. So Googling, the internet is like really wonderful. Um, and there's lots of resources out there. Surprisingly, like Teen Vogue online has some really good content on like LGBTQ issues and like I think like positive like representations of like LGBTQ folks out in the world. And so yeah, Instagram is also like super queer. I don't know how that happened. And also Twitter. So there's like lots of people that you can follow like on Twitter, like I think Erica Hart, oh gosh, I'm there's also them, just like them, like the pronoun. I think like that's their Twitter handle. And just like creates like a lot of content about like non-binary stuff. So yeah, the internet is a great place for like self-education. I think like also like things that you can do as an ally, like in terms of just like internally, like definitely like asking yourself like if you don't have like LGBTQ friends, to just kind of like reflect on why that is, because more often than not, like there are actually LGBTQ people around you. They may not have just shared that with you because they may not have felt safe enough to say that to you. And so what are the things that you can do to like make environments safer for like other LGBTQ folks? So I don't know, I think like for example, like people making like jokes about gay people, or like calling somebody, like describing something as like, oh, that's gay, isn't that actually really funny? Because jokes can turn into really violent things. It can turn into bullying, it can turn to violence. So like interrupting people when they say hurtful things, or like use the term "that's so gay," not in a positive way, are things that you can do to be a good ally. And then what does our office do? I would say particularly like in my job, a lot of the things that we do is like host events that are that center like LGBTQ issues, or like sometimes we'll bring in like a speaker who identifies as queer or trans or both. We do a lot of things around like health. So, oop, I'm at 6%. Okay, there we go. I think I'm charging. Okay. All right. I'm not going to die yet. Some other things that our office does is we do provide like one-on-one support for LGBTQ students who need that. College is really hard. And doing college as a queer person, a trans person, or a queer and trans student of color is, like really hard too. And so we provide support around that, whether it's like exploring their identities or finding a resource, both on campus or off campus. LGBTQ folks, and particularly like LGBTQ young people, have a high risk of suicidality, and so and part of that is just because like we live in a society that does not take kindly to LGBTQ folks. Trans people are denied access to healthcare often, or are discriminated against. And I would say that that's more intense for like queer and trans people of color, and for like Black, queer, and trans folks too. And so that's not to, and so I think that mental health is something that is challenging for LGBTQ folks, but especially for LGBTQ folks of color. And so we do help in like finding resources and support for that, especially if it's not something that we can handle ourselves. So we also do a lot of like social events for LGBTQ students, just to like hang out. We don't really have to do anything, no learning, just hanging out, food. We also like provide spaces for folks to hang out in the Student and Equity and Arts Lounge. But unfortunately, COVID-19 is here, and we can't really do that right now. But typically we would do that if there wasn't a pandemic. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So do you guys have any other questions about First Peoples, about LGBTQ issues, about multicultural issues, because they support LGBTQ communities as well as multicultural communities. And Evergreen's unique in that Evergreen has one office that handles that type of stuff versus other campuses who have kind of offices divided up. And so you may have some questions about that, but we have a couple more minutes if you guys are curious about anything, or if you're wondering at all about the office, if they hire students, you know, any number of questions you can have. Do you have any questions for our team?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious. So Upward Bound, like, I guess, is this the Shelton one, or okay, cool.
Yeah. This is the Shelton program, and actually specifically we're the Bridge program. So the students who are here are going to be going to Evergreen in the fall.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Raymundo's going to Evergreen?
Didn't you say that, Mundo? Yeah.
That's so cool. That is so cool. Yes, please stop by our office. You're also welcome to just stop by there anytime when things open back up. But please feel free to reach out to our office if you have any questions, or if you're just like, I don't know how to fill out this form, but I'm pretty sure Reva would probably would know about things like that before me. But wow, I'm so excited for y'all.
Yeah, so this is another resource available to you guys. If you find that Trio's not making time for you because they're swamped with all their caseload of students, if you find that you can't get in to see an advisor, or maybe the advisor is making assumptions about what you want and they're pushing you toward classes that don't really make sense to you, or if you really hate your professor and you want someone to go just yell about this professor too, you're welcome to come to my office, but that's what students do in Amira's office. They complain about things that they see as unfair, like if Lily at any point you're the only Native American in the classroom and they assume that you know everything about what Native Americanness is, right? Or if Mundo, people assume things about you because you have a Spanish last name, right? And that you actually have a more complicated identity than that. Then their office is a good place to go and talk about some of these things and vent about some of these struggles. And actually, if they hear enough of these stories, actually that office usually will spark bigger changes for students of color, because they're part of what our offices do, and we look at equity and inclusive excellence, and we want to make sure everyone feels like they belong. And so when students go and they talk to Amira, or they talk to Hannah or Meryl, or now it's Jacob, right? Jacob is going to be there now too. Any one of their staff members, and they're complaining about things that we can see are microaggressions, but maybe you students are dismissing as, well, this is my fault, right? Like they teach you to do in high school, right? Like people tell you you're a bad student in high school, and then you go to college and you find out all that questioning authority actually makes you a good student in college, right? Then that office is available to you. It doesn't matter how you identify. If you identify as white, but you're still struggling with some of these equity issues, if you identify as a person of color, this is definitely a good place for you. If you identify as on the spectrum, or if you want to just volunteer and help support other people on campus to be successful, just knowing that there's a lot working against these people, like in these underrepresented positions, and just being an ally can be a big boost. Tú eres mi otro yo. We're in this together, and everybody is another one of ourselves. And so we need to be supportive of our team. We need to build a strong cohort and realize that we could save someone's life just by reaching out and saying, hey, do you want to work together on this assignment? Right? And that could take place in the SEAL, where they always have the best food. You guys always have the best food. The rest of us, we have to get Aramark, but you guys get the good cultural food.
The good. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, please reach out anytime. We do work pretty closely with Trio, and we have oftentimes the students that we see are also Trio students, and so our office is not we see Trio students all the time. They hang out in our spaces. We love Trio students. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Amira. And thank you, First Peoples, for coming and introducing some of these more complicated and sensitive topics to us. We're going to work with some of the other Evergreen offices and see how all of these different offices work together to support you guys. But this is kind of the first step, getting to know what you're about to get into for the fall. And just be aware things might be on Zoom a little bit in the fall, but we'll eventually get back to being able to go to the SEAL and stuff. So.
It was nice meeting y'all.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.